going to start by drawing some lines. So once again, you want to visualize, do that again here, those major lines of your 1-point perspective. So I could actually do this with some pencils, some color pencils, and you could almost really just confirm visually, like, okay, that's it. If we miss the angle on one of these, everything gets thrown off. So right there and right about there is where I would see it. And it's actually a little higher. I'm talking about the frame of the paper. This one goes right into the corner over here. So I would say it's something like this. And once you visualize that and you can put it down, pretty much everything else falls into place. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to keep some of these lines very light and exaggerate the angle just a little bit more. Now I could keep going with this line all the way until that vanishing point, but I know at some point it cuts off right about here. So I want to find that point where it's always helpful to visualize the center and match that with your, which is, I could see where the wall, so that points to the lower part of the wall and gives me a better clue to add second and third lines. And then once again, just connect the dots basically. And for this one, we know we are off to the edge over here, and we're going to match that angle and just have it cross. Now I've also mentioned when you work with lines like this, the clock is extremely helpful. So this is, if you're looking at it this way, it's not 9 o'clock, it's not 12 o'clock. So is it 10, 11? No, it's about 10:20, I would say, 10:15. And it should be pretty, it seems like it's simple, a simple composition. So once you have these lines and everything seems like it's coming together, you notice that he blurred the edges. So some of the corners of the walls meeting, I'm gonna just tap a little bit of graphite that got a little too heavy, because I also do want that effect, and find that vanishing point. Now with this vanishing point, which means this line and this line on my 1-point perspective coming together, from that line I want to make sure I see all others. They have to line up. So my windows here at the top, or that variation of the color of the wall, should follow this perspective. And it goes to this wall here from here. So this is the top of the doors. And even for the bottom, you want it almost in a straight line there. If you want to take it all the way, then you would find this small element. It's right at the edge. And also in the opposite direction, which means right up here. Again, there's a big clue right at the edge of this frame there. But having these lines in the proper perspective, you see how everything is becoming undeniable in terms of how we set up the space. We have this little lamp right here, element, with the little window, a little closer. And then these, which will eventually line up with the shift in color here. So we have that lower white wall, and then a few of these doors just vertical. So he may have done this just like we're doing here, a few lines, but not excessive detail, just to guide This one seems to be a little higher, but following that same perspective. And I think it's the most important one here, that shadow with that lighter area of wall, I believe is something very, it rhythms the light and this harsher shadow here, which may be maybe a little too wide there. With that nice angle. And then the step. And then this window, which is off the frame. And I'm just going to put a marker there, just a placing. And I think that, well, one more. Let's go ahead and just match this window here to that same perspective. And then the top of this door right there. Just to have that line. You absolutely want to have those lines. And again, it's just a quick brush stroke, but that top line right there, if you catch that angle of the perspective, it makes all of the difference. And then we have a little bit of wall, and that arch just comes right over, almost to the top, with beautiful shadow. So how we develop that, also with a little bit of light in there. I noticed as I do this, he used a lot of different techniques, simple techniques. A little bit of that dry brush, but also layers. So he worked it really slow, meticulous, allowing some of that wet on wet. There we are. And then we follow what I consider to be helpful strategy, from biggest and simplest to smaller, and also from lightest. So I have a few colors here. I have a raw sienna, yellow ochres. I'm going to look for that overall warm, just like we did on the previous one. And I do have a tiny bit of spectrum here where it pulls towards violet. And we could always test it just a little bit lighter. There it is. Make sure you have a paper towel in case you need to lift. And I think that may be a little too red. So let's pull it back towards a yellow. A little bit warmer. And just create a nice wash. Most important areas here, you want to make sure you preserve some of those lines, preserve some of that white, and you have the timing. You want to make sure the timing for some of that violet and the wet on wet technique to pop up as the most important thing. A little bit of white preserved right there for that lamp. Little streak of white on the wall, hinting at the light coming from above. A little bit more towards the warm for this wall, especially back here. Notice I'm using quicker, drier strokes, adding a little more of that violet right into this area so it's not just a layer. And just a little bit more warmth. Making this a little more wet on wet. Trying to also see some of that dry brush and anticipating what I need to do with watercolor techniques. For the blending of some of these edges as they begin to get more saturated. Do we have, can we see a temperature to that back wall? It's very difficult, but it's absolutely the lightest value. So I'm going to go ahead and add just a tiny bit. And I am doing actually a little bit cooler. Because that's how I read it. And very, very low value. And the temperature, just so you get an idea, it's about right here. That stroke that I did down here. And that's going to repeat in some of these when it gets a little drier. But I want to bring that as the moisture is perfect for the layering on some of these areas. Oops, that was way too blue. A little more patience with the mixing. And even begin to read the light overall just a little bit better. Some strokes that fall in begin to get more condensed. I'm going to bring in just a little bit of burnt umber as I add more saturation. And I also have a sepia, which I'm going to want to blend with a touch of that violet for some of this area here. Oh, perfect. And I think that will be the color that will absolutely bring this out in the back just a little bit more. Lots of wet on wet. Notice how the pigments, the brush strokes, obviously the combination of colors are put together. Let me go back into that. I'm mixing my own with burnt umber and ultramarine blue to create sort of a spectrum of blue grays. Be able to push it a little more towards the blue or a little more towards the brown, with few touches that begin to give us also granulation up in this area. And just as we saw from the sketch, a variation to the light. Oop, went a little too far there. Have I said the word today? Looseness. Be ready to switch brush when you're ready, when you need to. Loosening up the style of the brush stroke, looking for that wet on wet. So I want to show you, it's almost not brushing, it's dabbing the paint in somewhat. And slowly building up as we squint. A bit of the saturation. And being able to manage also the techniques that you're looking for. So don't be afraid to just dab, bring, move the water, push, pull. I don't feel like captured the soft edge of almost violet. So I'm going to reintroduce that right there before it fully dries. That almost spills over to this wall over here. And there's some dry brush. As I begin to do that a little more, the moisture on the paper is beginning to read. Allow me to do the techniques a little bit better. Let those colors begin to blend like we would want them to, as the strokes, brush strokes, get a little bit smaller, a little less wet. Oop, a little too much pigment. Trying to see the variation of color up here. Since I brought in a little bit of sepia and there's also that gray, I'm gonna just layer it slowly, carefully. I know it did have a bit of granulation in it, at least this area here. But you want to work to your advantage, whether it's color mixing, your color scheme, or your watercolor techniques, your brushing skills. One of those things as your main focus. Obviously, all of them get you closer and closer to where we want to be. But even if it's one of those things where you focus on what you know, you can do more comfortably, use that to your advantage. What I'm trying to say is, by trying to do too much, sometimes we focus less on the things we know we can shebang, make a big splash. And little by little, all of the areas get stronger. And you notice the timing and the speed. And I mean by speed, the faster, slow pace that you need to work. I'm going to go ahead and switch brushes. Need a finer point, less moisture. Maybe lift just a little bit of light here. Right into that gray, black that we mixed. And we're going to, hopefully not too wet here. You want to make sure it's sharp edges. You want to make sure you have, as we're drawing now, because this is literally just sketching color right in with the brush and having some of those sharp edges. As we build in the illusion. Some of those elements, very, very important. So the contrast and the sharp edge, both very, very important here. Also the moisture, how you handle that. I'm going to add a little bit of violet. So like a reflected light with a little bit of that gray, and have that up at the top. And you see how the light almost reflects and gets lighter as it comes more towards us. I'm going to try to emulate that. Very simple, very easy brush strokes. A little bit on the side and a little more right on the edge. Now some of these lines are not looking as straight edged as I should have. You know, there's a warp to this door here. Let's go ahead and try to bring that a little bit closer to where we want it. There we go. When you see this, how he uses the quick and very versatile use of brush for all of the different combinations of wet on dry, wet on wet, blossoming, spillover, dry brush. It's pretty amazing, really. And when you stop to think about it, it may be too late. It has to be sort of intuitive. And from practice, from experience, you're always testing. Even if you've done dry brush a million times, this one's going to be very, very unique, very special. Completely different from all the others because of everything else that's around it. Beginning to add a little more saturation and just a few extra layers. I love how this arch here and the light on it, again with those nice sharp edges here and there, mostly on the other side. And a little bit of that gray right back. Trying to bring in a little more of that look of casual looseness, confidence, with the color mixing and application. Comes a time when you need to slow down. You have to ask the question, how many times have you squinted today? If you're looking at light, have you seen it? Can you squint at it and then at your piece? And do you see, are there things revealing to, oh, look at this. Could use a little more value here. A little more light. Going back into the burnt umber. And I'm trying to measure some of the temperatures I see here. There's a bit of coolness on this wall with the violet, of course. And some of these shadows, obviously they're a little more saturated. I don't want to make them too warm. They just happen to be there very loosely. They're not all the same color. So you want to be careful not to overuse that mix. Only where you really need it. Bringing in just a little more saturated pigment. That same blend of burnt umber, ultramarine blue, which almost looks black. That's what I want. We're going to start putting some of it here. And very easily it could go blue or brown, cool or warm. Just dump some of that in there. We begin to see some of that dry brush that he handles so well, so perfectly. Very hard to try to imitate and emulate. You have to really just come up with your own. So take it as inspiration and then work your own brushstroke, trying to copy it exactly as he did. Number one, it's impossible. It'll get close. But what if you come up with a better one? A better version of dry brush for, say, this window or the bars on this window. Still deconstructing a little bit towards the light. And always realizing you're doing some beautiful editing. Editing out information, doing a bit of abstraction. What do we need? What don't we need? What do I leave in? What do I take out? As they begin to get smaller, darker, and sharper, I want to slow down just a little bit more, be more careful. Pulling in a little bit of light. And knowing how far to take variations of these colors and the contrast of them, that's the challenge. Some of them getting more and more refined. And as usual, I bring it up. How much detail is too much detail? But don't be afraid to play with those combinations of color. Put some violet in there, put some burnt umber in there. This one, for example, it's definitely going to be more blue than brown. And I'm talking about the variation, the mix of that gray that I've been using here. So I want to see a little more blue in it. Although it reads as black. remember the formulas. It comes down to lines, shapes, and overall contrast. So some of the contrast from the sharpness to the blurriness, use that to your advantage to create that illusion of space and perspective. Let's see if I can get some of this dry brush happening here. Wow, just made the light look a little more interesting there. Like a lot of shapes to that shadow. There we go. But that's what we want. I kind of missed it just a little bit, although I love the accidental lifting that I did here, creating a little bit of harsh contrast with the soft but almost reflected back to light here. But as long as you feel like you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, playing with your color mixes, spending time looking at them, understanding what it is you're trying to do, as you mix your colors. And that is the whole point, having fun doing that. Remember, the outcome just happens to be the record the product of the experience. But it's about how you enjoy this process of seeing light, seeing shadow, seeing color, deconstructing, trying to match, but always having fun with it. Not putting pressure on yourself. There's a nice read that he did here, almost like this stain, drip of water you could see from the age, the time, the wetness of this area of the wall here, right under the window, dripping down. There we go. Some of these final touches with detail. Keep them loose. Keep them as loose as possible. There it is. A little better layering for this edge of this door. Giving us a better sense of light, actual opening in there. And the struggle sometimes with such simple elements, because there are very, very simple elements working out on this piece here. The perspective, the lines, no hard edges, or not many of them. Very few touches of detail, or what we usually would consider detail. Forces you to become more efficient with color mixing, with the brush. And I still feel there's much more I could do, but I'm going to let this sit and dry for a little bit. As I'll know, I'll also have a better reaction to it later as it begins to dry, and the right timing for. I need to bring this in a little bit more. Avoiding the overcooking of my piece. So the final question is, did I have fun? Yes, I did. Was it challenging, and did it force me to think about a new thing or things that I know I've used before, but had to revisit and rethink? So yeah, a few of the lines missing are just a matter of letting this dry and coming back with a little more dry brush here and there. A lot of the wet, unwet that needed to happen happened very nicely, actually. And then take a second look. But I know there's a little lamp right there with a nice little touch of yellow and that light that I've preserved right there, but I am going to need that to be fully dry in order to come back and finish that. But this, and I feel, yeah, I may have gotten a little bit shift in the color, in the temperature of some of the colors. Maybe a little extra lifting of light in some areas. Just a few. Extra lines. Ooh, that was nice right there. That's what it needed. And overall, happy. So I'm going to switch over to the second image. And work on a quick sketch of it. So I'm going to put this aside for a second. And I am going to use watercolor paper for this one. I'm going to use some of this washi tape, a little bit of masking tape, create a nice frame. Also trying to emulate the ratio, the proportion. And it should be fun. This one I'm going to have a little more fun with, trying to really, from life, as we're working from a, well, from a photo, where we don't have all of the answers given to us, like in the Sargent, go more for that loose, really loose Sargent look. That is the goal of these exercises. So we have, there it is, got my nice frame. Perfect. And same, start with my drawing. I am going to, once again, look for the clues. And if I can't find the lines, then I'm going to find the angles matching the edges of the frame. One big important thing is find your center. So it happens to be that column right in the middle. So if I could visualize that, and where exactly in that center, talking about the position and the height. Okay, so it's right about here, the height of it. I could actually see more clues coming together for the angle, and just continue it. Well, this may be a little bit harsh there. And some of those lines that we need to figure out. So once again, because we're in the shadows, I don't see exactly, but I figure it's right over here, right almost at the corner, but not exactly into the corner, more to the side of this frame, and right about there, throwing up a diagonal, a vertical, straight vertical. And then one more very important angle, which is this one here, intersecting these two lines. And just like that, I have the position of my second column, which is also vertical. And I'm just leaving a little bit of space. I'm not adding any of the details. I may want to consider a little bit of negative space drawing here and do a little bit of the thickness. And find the next line, which is this one here. Going by, also edge of the frame here, which gives us the base for both of these columns right here and then right here. We mentioned the thickness of it. That should be enough right there. And I think the next big element that we need to figure out is, yes, we have this line, but then this space here, that framing for this arch. Which would put us right about here. And just off the top, almost in the center. Notice the spacing from the edge of this column and the edge of the frame. It's a little wider, it's a little closer to this one. And how far off from the top? Right about there. Just a simple read. Very important to capture this angle. So they are going into the same vanishing point, so they maintain that angle going in this direction. I think I may have done a little bit too wide. So my read of the arch was the exterior. That feature. So right here, bring it in a little bit closer, and then sort of the frame of it. Let's go ahead and add that now because it will give us the next important piece of the puzzle, which is these lines, the thickness, and a back wall. There we are. Coming together very quickly. Right behind this second column. Oop. Overdid the here. There is no line there. This, I think it's perfect for this composition, coming across right at the column, right at the edge, and making sure you cross the bottom right into the corner. So simply connecting these 2 points, you find that angle. And we have 2 columns right in the middle. Just going to space them right here, and then you can decide edit or not. The third one right all the way at the edge. And then the corner of this shape over here points at the top. One more column right over here. That's actually a nice, beautiful, contrasting light to shadow to light that happens between here. So that rhythm of it is going to be really nice. I decide whether you want to put those plants in, and why not. Interesting shadows are going to happen there. Also, those pops of color are a must. Not so sure about the entire plant, but more like the pot and the detail, the color of it. That will be interesting. We also have a window, a series of columns up at the top. It almost looks like a window. That should follow the same vanishing point. But as you can see, it goes right from the top to a little lower, giving us another clue for this. There we go. More of these details just sketched in. Columns match and line up right with it. Here's the next element. And we'll also add that window. I think I'm ready to start watercoloring. There's a few lines that break the pattern here on the floor. And we also have this, which we could play with, and some of those grains. Wow, okay, happy with that drawing. Let's go right back into color mixing. Biggest, simplest, and also lightest. Go right back into that beautiful. I'm going to use a little bit of raw sienna. And then I have a burnt sienna as well. Mix a little bit of both of those. And bring that ultra light look right into this space. Way lighter. It almost feels like it could be a little bit warmer too, yellower, or I'm sorry, redder, pinker. Some of this color spills over to other areas, even some of the columns. I don't want them to be fully white of the paper. I want them to have some of that nice touch of color. Very, very light. Well, this one doesn't have any at all. But just sketching your way through some of the color underneath. Beautiful. I begin to see some of that wet on wet that could begin to just pop up right there at the base and edges. So I'll bring that right in. Still too wet. And not to lose all of the sense of the color here, meaning I could work over it. I'm going to lighten. Obviously, it's still very wet in some other areas, but I want to bring it all the way to the back wall, which is almost water, just white. And why not just let it bleed in? Because we know when it dries, it will be lighter. Since this is very wet and I don't want to work this area, although it's a big element, because it's a lot darker, I'm going to go into this bottom area here, where we start a little warmer. Catching a tiny bit of those grays. Notice I added a tiny bit of violet, which we know Sargent loves when working with shadows. And some of those are actually going to be the grays that I'll use for these two areas. So they will bleed in. That's totally fine. Really working with that looseness. I'm going to bring some of that shadow right into these columns. I know it's still very wet, so I don't want it to bleed out into the areas of light. We also have a nice gradient happening with the edge of this column here. And instead of using black for shadows, let's dig in a little bit cooler. This is the base color I'm working with. It's it's a blue-violet that I plan to bring in to the neutral zone with some burnt umber, just like this. But its base color is that. And make sure you wait until it's dry in some of these. You do not want those edges, especially this hard edge. I also learned from the previous how I want to manage some of the straight lines with the brush. So when I did the doors and I struggled a little bit with detail, which is just a simple, clear, straight line. Work a little more patient with some of those strokes. This may not be, but because it's still moist, I'm going to bring some of that same violet right into the shadow area, even though it may not be the final. Do we really begin to get that sense of space that we're looking for? So my concern, what I really wanted to work with, the looseness. And although we have sharp edges here, and he does work with those sharp edges beautifully. Bring this over very carefully. And play with that brush stroke. So this is going to change just a bit. I hope to, in this area, where I want some of these columns to really hold their own. So I make this a little darker, meaning pushing towards the black. Just testing the space there, making sure I can work in and around the detail of some of these shapes, the straight lines that I need for this to read as architectural. And a few second layers here as we darken, complete these shadow areas. So I'm feeling that's so important. The stage where your mindset, which is what is important, it's what we're really trying to work out here. How to develop the confidence and the mindset that allows you to do this over and over. When I begin to feel that stiffness, I want to really pull back and breathe. Number one, okay, what's going on? Why am I getting my vision, my observation skill, my observation exercise here? Don't want to lose that. And it usually happens when we get obviously more specific, more detailed, I need to get in here with just a touch of gray. Very, very light gray. Maybe warm it up just a little bit. Add a little extra shadow there for the break of light in the background. But it is a beautiful, beautiful, interesting light. Courtyards always, I mean, they are popular for a reason. The lighting that happens in a small area, small space, all the variations. Let's bring some of that up here as well. I'm going to switch brushes and go into warmer yellow ochre, touched it with a bit of that gray. Squinting, don't forget squinting, and trying to get that technique, watercolor technique. We don't want to just be coloring in the lines here like it was a coloring book. I know what I goes. I want some of that technique, some of that looseness. Your skill as a watercolor artist to showcase, to show up. Allowing the magic of watercolor to show up. Gradual transition, just a little more as the first layer. And this obviously will get just a little darker. Let me go ahead and bring in the first pop of nice touch of color there. Just a few linear breaks to the pattern. More saturation. And beginning to sharpen the edges, break the space for a better read. So as we said, this eventually needs to be in the shadow or in the shade here, creating more sense of space between that and the background. And this background, although it's in light, will have to be just a little bit darker value with a nice contrast from the shadow underneath. So there it is, starting to come together. Now see, this got way too light. I see it as that early first wash. Because again, contrast, when things are light and set next to darker, they appear lighter. I think that'll do better. Just a little bit better. I'm going to go back into the burnt umber, a little more ultramarine. I'm going to give this, very dangerous here, but I want to give this a more consistent, more uniform, and just same color, almost the same value, but just a more uniform layer. So the shadows are all one family here, one big shape. And I got to do it a little bit quicker than I did last time, so it reads as that. And there may be a third layer going into some of these, but immediately I see that, yep, it pays off. I could actually lighten, bring a little touch of water, and use the previous layer to create just a tiny bit of variation in it. And that feels better. Still got to rework lots of areas here in this very detailed background. But we can always do that with just the right brush at the right time. There's a nice easy way to layer that, and you can see, hopefully you see the shadows coming across. We usually get in trouble there where we feel we have to saturate with detail, but most of the time you could say it's so simple, so easy with just a few strokes. Adding just a touch to these layers here, that nice geometric pattern here. Little variation to the color, maybe begin to add a little more blue. Cooler transitions. And a little more, oops, too thick. Bring it down. Now I gotta be honest, I don't feel like I'm taking true advantage, and I think that is the biggest. Becoming Sargent really is the toughest thing when you deal with all of this information, color mixing, values, layers, temperatures, contrast, composition, on and on and on, plus what I summarize as looseness, but it all comes down to just mastering your technique, being so confident with it that you're not trying to recreate the photograph, but instead you have the confidence and looseness to really play with watercolor. To take risks. And for me is to see a little more of the magic of watercolor, more of those blossoms and wet on wet techniques that seem to be missing here. Overall, it's becoming just a little too direct, too straightforward. Too obvious would be the word. Adding just a touch of this green here, doing speck, scribble, scumble, and lift. Adding a little extra shadow. This is going to have to wait for it to really take shape as the layer of shadow that I want to create here, the break. For volume, to really create that sense of light. Just a few strokes here and there. Begin to bring that closer to finished. Just a little bit lighter. And here's where I would pause. Have to wait for a lot of these areas to dry a little bit better. Re-examine some of the color choices here. How I'm going to create better contrast between some of these spaces. Decide how much quality of line and detail that I will take further into areas like this. But I think we're pretty close, and this would be the time pause, take a look, re-examine. And maybe start the next one. But that was fun. I hope you guys enjoyed it.